This is the reason we should never use fetch API for API calls. Welcome everyone. This is Rahul from Caps Code. Let's get into the video. So let's say I have a valid API endpoint which is api.github.com/users, which will give the valid user from the some valid random username from the GitHub. Okay, let's consume this using fetch API. I have written a code. I am hoping that you know that how to use fetch API. Okay, let's try this. This is the fetch API. This is the API endpoint. Okay, so as the API endpoint is valid, this will work absolutely fine. It will first go into the first dot then method. Okay, and it will return a valid promise, and then as the promise is valid, it will again enter inside the second dot then method. Okay, and it will print the success message along with the result, which is a JSON data, right? As you can see here, the response, this is a valid JSON data, right? So this fetch API will absolutely work if your API endpoint is valid. Okay, the problem starts. Okay, let's see with some invalid API endpoint. Let's say I am using the API endpoint, which is api.mygithub.com/user. Okay, as you know that this API endpoint is invalid. Let's see this. This API endpoint is invalid. Okay, it will return some network error, right? Let's try to consume this using fetch API. As you can see in the screen that when I tried calling this API endpoint using fetch API, it directly enter inside this .catch method, right? Which is absolutely okay. The problem start when you try to consume the API endpoint with some invalid resource. When the API endpoint is actually invalid, but the base URL is valid. You can see here the base URL, which is api.github.com. This is a valid API endpoint, but the resource which it trying to consume is invalid, right? This my user. If you can see here, I can show you that this API endpoint is invalid. See, this message is not found. This resource is actually not found in this URL, right? Let's try to consume this. If you try to consume this API endpoint using fetch API, now the problem start. As this base URL is valid, it will enter inside the dot then method rather than entering inside the dot catch method directly, right? So it will enter inside the dot then method, okay, and it will return a valid response, a JSON response, which is a valid promise. As a promise is valid, it will again enter inside the second dot then method, and it will print the success message along with the JSON result. As you can see here in the response, it will first print the response, right? And it enter inside the second dot then method. Okay, and it print the JSON output, which is a message, and a message is not found. And this is the URL, whatever URL it is. Let's see. So yeah, but if we use this fetch API like this, then you might encounter some error, some bug in your application. So the problem here is, rather entering inside the dot catch method directly, it entered inside the then, and then again it got entered inside the second then, okay, which is a problem. So how we can resolve this out using fetch API itself? What we can do is we can write a condition. Let's take the same example, okay, with the valid base URL but an invalid resource, the endpoint. Okay, let's take this example and try to resolve this. Okay, so what we have done is as the API endpoint is the base URL is valid, it will enter inside the dot then method. Okay, and here it is a response. What we are doing is we are first consoling the response. Let's see what's inside the response. Okay, so if you can see the output, the response is the OK is false, and the status text is empty string, and the status is 404. Okay, so we can use these two basically to write the condition, and based on these two values we can decide whether to reject the promise or resolve the promise. Okay, and based on that it will enter inside the dot catch method, right? So what we have done is we have written a condition: if response.ok, then return a response.json. Response.json is a valid promise, as you know. Else, what we are doing is we are returning a promise.reject. As we are rejecting the promise, it will enter inside the dot catch method instead of getting inside the dot then method. Okay, as you know that the response.ok is false, so what it will do is it will go inside the else statement, okay, and it will reject the promise and it will print the error, and this is the error message: error, API failed with 404. So this is how we usually handle the API call in fetch API. So this is a best practice if you are using fetch API, but I would not suggest to use this fetch API when you are a pro developer or you are developing some production level application. Better use some libraries like Axios, RTK. There are a lot of other libraries which I have documented here. If you want to read the documentation format of this rather than video one, then you can go to this link, okay, and you can check out this whole documentation with a very in-depth detail of each and everything. And yeah, that's it. Thank you so much. See you in the next video.